Hi Year 5s and welcome to Friday's English session, and today we are going to be finishing off our writing of the Nowhere Emporium, and we are going to be writing a mysterious ending for our prologue. We're going to be reviewing some of the complex sentences that we've had a look at today, and we're going to have a go at using dashes for extra information or parentheses. So dashes are those two little lines that you can see around the word parenthesis. We're going to be using those in our writing today. Let's have a look at some of the words we've seen this week. We saw the word pallid. Pallid, if you remember, means not very strong. So we looked at the pallid rays of the winter sun. They were not very strong. And we saw the word existence, didn't we? ENCE means that we are talking about a noun. So, challenge to you, can you make some little words out of these words here? So, for example, from pallid, I can make the word lid. From existence, I can make the word exist, and I can make the word 10. How many words can you make out of pallid and existence? Pause the video now and write them down on your piece of paper. Okay, let's have a look at some of the complex sentences that we saw this week. We described the dove, didn't we? A dove whose feathers glistened in the moonlight emerged from the darkness. A dove whose wings whispered among the crowds emerged from the darkness. And if you remember, whose is a relative pronoun, and this extra information that we've used with commas is called a relative clause because it starts off with a relative pronoun. It's giving more information about the dove, isn't it? Let's look a bit more about relative pronouns. So we can add extra additional detail about a noun by adding a relative clause to a sentence. So we can say, instead of saying Sarah is eating roast chicken, it is her favourite meal, we can combine the two sentences together. Sarah is eating spaghetti, which is her favourite meal. A relative clause is connected to the main clause by a relative pronoun. We've replaced the pronoun it in the second sentence with the relative pronoun which. A relative clause always starts with a relative pronoun. Examples of relative pronouns are whose, which, who, that, whom. Can you spot the relative pronouns in these sentences? So can you spot the relative pronoun there? What about this one? Josie, who loves to play football, was picked for the county team. Sadiq, whose pen had run out, put his hand up to ask for another one. The boy whom you met last week is coming to visit later. Can you spot the relative pronouns? Write them down now. That's right. So we should have had which, who, whose, whom, and that. Where can a relative clause be placed? So a relative clause can be placed at the end of a sentence, or it can be placed in the middle or embedded in the sentence. So it can be at the end. The class were well behaved on the school trip, which made their teacher proud. Or it can go in the middle, like it did when we described our dove wings. William, who was wearing his favourite shirt, was going to the school disco. You can see it at the end there, as well. Can you write a relative clause about the following pictures? Write it down on your piece of paper now. You could have this. The children who all wore helmets were excited about their cycling trip. Or, my cat, which was black and white, got stuck up a tree. Let's have some more practice. I'm going to choose a square and see if we can write a picture about that. So it looks like a scientist, doesn't it? And it looks like she is holding a jar there with with maybe perhaps some sort of virus or bacteria in there. So what do you think you could do? What kind of sentence could you make with that using a relative clause? Something like the scientist who is wearing glasses observed the bacteria closely. Write your sentence down. Let's try another one. Let's try this. Oh, so we've got a nice calm sea there, mountains and clouds. You could have something like the sky, which was cloudy, reflected the blue sea. Write your version down now. Okay, so today we are going to be writing about the gathering of the crowd and their initial actions before entering the shop. Let's just remind ourselves of the part of the story that we are at. The writing hung in the air just long enough for everyone to read it, and then the words began falling to the ground, a rain of golden light. The crowd laughed in delight, reaching out to catch the sparks as they fell. That's where we got to yesterday, wasn't it? Everybody who'd gathered outside the Emporium was entranced. No one had ever seen a spectacle such as this. One by one they walked forward, touched the sparkling black brickwork, examined the tips of their fingers, and then they stepped through the door to find out what was waiting. 2 days later, when the shop had vanished, a stranger arrived in the village. He was polite and he paid for his room with stiff new banknotes. But something about him, his startling height perhaps, or the hungry look in his cold blue eyes, troubled the villagers. He asked questions about a shop built from midnight bricks. But the tall man couldn't find a single person in the village who could recall the Emporium. Within a day, he too was gone, and all trace of these strange events faded from the history of the place. Those who'd walked through the Emporium's doors had no memory of anything they might have seen inside. More importantly, none of them recalled the price of admission, the little piece of themselves they'd given for a glimpse at the Emporium's hidden secrets and wonders. Bring your imagination, the sign had requested. So let's just have a think now about how the crowd could be staring in disbelief at the sight before them. So I have included in my example, the crowd stood open-mouthed, gawping at the sight before them. Or we could have entranced, the crowd huddled in disbelief, gasping at the flashes of light before them. So on your piece of paper, write down your example to describe the crowd as they are open-mouthed and huddling. Do that now. And then the next bit we're going to be focusing on is this strange stranger that has arrived in the village. So they introduce him 2 days later. So in your piece, you could have something like some time later or a few days later, or as suddenly as it had appeared, it disappeared to tell your reader that you are moving on. The shop had vanished. A stranger arrived in the village. He was polite and he paid for his room with stiff new banknotes. So, how does your character behave? Is he very polite, or is he perhaps a little bit cold and unfriendly? So, talk about his mannerisms, talk about his behaviour. And then something about him, you're going to talk about his physical features now, his startling height perhaps, or the hungry look in his cold eyes. So I've got these examples here. You could have perhaps say something like his unsettling manner or his concerning disposition or his strange glare or stance you could include. So perhaps choose some of those words there that you might want to use to describe the man's manner or his strange physical appearance maybe. So let's have a look at the example here. Something about him, his unsettling tone, his perturbing glare, or the concerned disposition he emitted, troubled the villagers. Can you see that I've used 3 negatives in a parenthesis? And a parenthesis is all it is the extra information about the man. So I have included that and I've done a little dash here at the beginning of my extra information and a little dash here at the end of my extra information. So on your piece of paper, can you write me a sentence like this using those dashes for extra information? So you're going to write something about him, dash, and give me 3 negatives. Perhaps it's his strange tone, his disturbing stare, or his worrying disposition, he admitted, troubled the villagers. So, what could you include as your three negatives, something that makes the villagers distrust him? Do that now on your piece of paper. So, your task for today, Year Fives, will be to look at the ending of your prologue. So, let's just remind ourselves what happens here. So, in the end of the Nowhere Emporium, he asked questions about a shop built from midnight bricks, but the tall man couldn't find a single person in the village who could recall the Emporium. So, perhaps you might want to stick with the story there and describe that actually he couldn't find a single person, or maybe in your version he does find a person who can remember what was inside the Emporium, and this person then tells him the wondrous sights that he saw inside the Emporium. Perhaps he saw strange books, perhaps he saw a magical world, perhaps he saw wands or cauldrons. So you are going to write the ending of your prologue. Perhaps it ends with the man disappearing, or perhaps it ends with the man talking to somebody that has been inside the shop. So tell me what happens at the end of your prologue. And so you are going to include these things. So describe the crowd's reactions as they enter the shop, describe the mysterious man and the villagers' reaction to him, and then finally your own little twist. Why do the villagers not remember what happens in the shop? Or maybe they do in your version, and you could describe what they could have seen. So I look forward to hearing and to reading your mysterious endings.